Hey guys, this is X What If and welcome back to What If Yuji Had AFO P4. Continuing where we left off, Yuji had just tamed Mahoraga, and his arsenal of curse techniques was now perfected. The only thing that was left to wait for was October 31st, when Kenjaku would throw the veil around Shibuya, and they would begin their attack on Gojou Satoru in order to seal him in the prison room. Yuji, the entire time waiting up for the incident, would have been training his heart out because he knew he had to face a monster like Gojou Satoru. On the other side, Megumi would have been training his heart out as well, being just as greedy as Yuji. He was going to show Yuji that he didn't need his technique and that he was strong enough to beat him with anything. Unknown to Yuji, Megumi would have been able to beat a special great curse spirit during his training, only utilizing the flame curse technique. Megumi, being greedy like Yuji, would have pushed his technique to brand new levels, while also being able to use reverse curse technique. Although he wouldn't have access to a domain, reverse curse technique was a huge bonus for him. Even though it sapped a lot of curse energy from him, it was still a huge bonus. As October 31st would come around, the Jujutsu sorcerers would be notified that there was a veil being put over Shibuya, and inside of the veil, they were asking for Satoru Gojo to come into the veil by himself, otherwise they would kill all the civilians that were trapped inside. The higher-ups and Gojo himself would know that this was a trap. However, Gojo didn't care. He knew he was the strongest. He was going to clean all of this up, and everybody would be safe. Megumi would tell Gojo to be careful, seeing as Yuji was still out there and he has his technique. Gojo would remember what he told Megumi a while ago, saying that in the past, a 10 Shadows user and a 6 Eyes Limitless user just like him had fought to the death and both of them had died. He would tell Megumi not to worry, that he's got this because he's the strongest and that there's nothing they need to worry about. Megumi could only give off a slight smile and tell Gojo to be careful. Gojo would tell Megumi that he's got this. As Gojo would enter the veil in Shibuya, he would go underground into the station, exactly where they told him to go. He would look around and see that there were no civilians inside. He would be confused as they threatened to kill civilians, yet there were none there. Just then, Yuji would appear and tell Gojo, yo. Gojo would look over, seeing Yuji with a wheel above his head. He would smile at Yuji and tell him that he's gotten all grown up now. Gojo would then look at Yuji with a serious face. Yuji would tell Gojo he isn't going to harm his sweet student, is he? Gojo would chuckle and tell Yuji that he's not his student anymore. Just then, Yuji would feel a force pull him in as he would get cracked across the face by Gojo. Yuji would turn his head up and smile. He would send dismantles towards Gojo as they would seemingly go through the barrier. As Gojo would ask Yuji, did he forget? But Yuji would tell Gojo that no, he hadn't forgot. He's just testing something out. Yuji would then summon Giant Serpent. He really only needs to last 1 minute against Gojo, so he would do anything in his power, just in case he couldn't kill Gojo. He would imbue the snake with an explosion technique, sending it towards Gojo, as Gojo would simply stand there and let the snake crash into him. But as the snake would crash, an explosion would go off, causing rubble and dust to go across the area. However, Gojo would simply use Lapse Blue, clearing the area of all dust and debris. He would then be confused, because Yuji was nowhere to be found. Just then, Yuji would come up from Gojo's shadow, sending a punch towards his face. Using domain amplification, Gojo would notice almost immediately, catching Yuji's fist, with Yuji telling Gojo that he could be touched, and the wheel on his head would begin to spin. Gojo would realize what Yuji was doing. He didn't realize that Yuji had grown this much in such a short amount of time. Being able to utilize domain amplification and his curse technique by switching domain amplification on and off, he was surprised that Yuji was able to push himself this far. The amount of training that he must have undergone must have been immense. Gojo would only smile and tell Yuji that he guesses he still is his student. Gojo would then teleport behind Yuji, attempting to punch him again. However, Yuji was already prepared, ducking underneath the punch, sending a kick. A kick imbued with domain amplification would crack Gojo across the face. Gojo would then begin to get excited because there was no one else that was really able to match him, though he would finally be able to go all out, even if it was on his student. He would grab onto Yuji's leg and throw him into a wall. Yuji would slam into the wall and Gojo would already be there, using blue on Yuji, pulling him forward and punching him in the stomach yet again, cracking him into the wall again, sending a huge shockwave throughout the subway. Yuji would cough up blood and begin to smile. He would grab onto Gojo's arm, sending a knee towards his head, slamming it against him. He would then flip off of Gojo, sending a kick upwards again, connecting with Gojo's chin. As he would land on the ground, he would send dismantles towards Gojo again, as yet again, they would seemingly go straight through his barrier. Gojo would be noticing this, but as Yuji would send the slashes yet again, the wheel on his head would turn one more time. Gojo, knowing what the technique was, he would tell himself that he had to get this over with quickly before he adapted to his infinity. he would use blue on Yuji again. Yet Yuji would use domain amplification again, surprising Gojou, seeing as Yuji wasn't pulled in that time. However, Gojou wouldn't care. He would then rush in at Yuji. He would send a right, as Yuji would duck underneath it, trying to send a right of his own. Gojou would grab the punch with his left, sending a knee towards Yuji's stomach, connecting, crashing into Yuji's stomach, sending him upwards. He would then use reversal red, blasting it into Yuji, sending him upwards yet again. He would block the attack. However, being caught off guard, Gojou would use blue, pulling him in again, but instead of allowing Yuji to try to get the chance to use domain amplification, he would close in, imbuing his fist with blue, crashing it into Yuji's stomach yet again. It would connect. However, Yuji was still prepared. He would block the attack with both of his hands, catching the punch with domain amplification. Just as he would do so, he would turn off his domain amplification, sending a cleave. However, just as Yuji thought, the infinity around Gojou would protect him from the cleave, negating the attack entirely. But yet again, the wheel on Yuji's head would spin. Yuji would laugh and say that he thinks he's got it now. Gojou would laugh and tell Yuji that he doesn't have anything. Gojou would grab Yuji by the collar and drag him across the side of the subway station, breaking apart the walls and throwing him. Gojou would then use blue to gather up all the debris to try to trap Yuji. Yuji would gather himself. However, it was far too late. The debris that Gojou had gathered would crash onto Yuji. Yuji would then use cleave on the debris, breaking it apart to try to figure out what Gojou was trying to do. Just as the debris would disperse, Gojou would already be in front of Yuji, throwing a kick towards his head. Yuji would be able to duck underneath it. However, yet again, Gojou would use blue, making Yuji be sent upwards, right into an overhead punch, cracking Yuji in the face, sending him back on the ground. Yuji would land on his feet, as Gojou would be seen above him, sending down an overhead kick. Yuji would dodge out of the way and grab Gojou's leg using domain amplification. He would send 3 quick jabs onto Gojou. Gojou would easily parry them, knocking his hand out of the way and sending a hook of his own. It would connect against Yuji again, sending him towards a wall again, crashing into it. But before Yuji could even catch his breath, Gojou was already in front of him, sending another combo. He would proceed to beat down Yuji badly, not allowing Yuji to get a single breath in, making sure he was to end Yuji right here and right now. Just then, Gojou would cock his fist back, getting ready to land the final blow. He would send a punch. However, Yuji would quickly make hand signs, summoning Rabbit Escape. As Gojou would send the punch, it would crash into one of the rabbits, as Yuji would duck into the shadow. As Gojou would land a black flash, Yuji would be terrified, seeing that if that attack had hit him, he most likely would have died. Yuji would smile yet again. He wasn't going to lose here. He was going to kill Gojou and take his technique. But before that, he still needed to talk to Gojou. It didn't matter though, because Gojou was now in the zone. Just as Yuji would come up from his shadow, Gojou would already be there, grabbing Yuji by the collar yet again and throwing him up into the air. He would follow up with a 3-hit combo, a right and a left cross followed by a double palm strike that would knock Yuji back into the wall again. Yuji simply couldn't escape Gojou no matter how hard he tried. Gojou wasn't giving him time to summon any Shikigami, or even use any techniques at that matter. The pressure from Gojou was simply too much. Gojou would continue his combo and attempt to end things again. However, the wheel on Yuji's head would spin yet again. Yuji would then let off a disturbing smile. This one moment had caught Gojou off guard for a quick second, but it was all Yuji needed. He would use hand signs, summoning Mahoraga, as Mahoraga would come out of his shadow and slash at Gojou. The Infinity would stop Mahoraga's slash. However, it would seem as if Infinity was getting weaker and weaker. Gojou would proceed to back up and ask Yuji did he really need some help. Yuji would then take a deep breath. He would then tell Gojou that before they finish their fight, he has something he wants to ask Gojou. Gojou would tell Yuji that he doesn't really feel like talking right now. However, Yuji would tell Gojou that he might want to hear this. Gojou would roll his eyes and tell Yuji that he's probably just scared since he's going to lose. Yuji would laugh and say he's definitely not going to lose here. He would then stare down Gojou and ask him, does he know anybody by the name of Kenjaku? Gojou would then raise an eyebrow and say that that name doesn't ring any bells for him. Yuji would then begin to explain how Kenjaku looked, as this would begin to shock Gojou. Kenjaku, hearing all this from the background, would begin to be pissed off. Yuji would continue telling Gojou about who Kenjaku was and what exactly he was planning. Gojou would be confused, asking Yuji why exactly he told him all of this, as Yuji would simply tell Gojou that he doesn't care. He's tired of listening to people who are weaker than him bark orders at him. He now understands why Sukuna did what he did. The only people that were worthy of saying anything were those who were strong, and Yuji himself is strong, unlike Kenjaku. Yuji planned on reshaping the world into exactly what he wanted, making sure the people of power are on top while everyone else sits at the bottom. If you have no power, you are simply useless. Gojou would tell Yuji that that kind of world seems boring and lonely, and that sitting at the top alone with all the power in the world isn't as fun as he might think it is. Yuji would tell Gojou that he doesn't think it's fun, he believes that it's necessary. Yuji would tell Gojou that the same thing happens at Jujutsu High. There are a bunch of old people who have no idea what they're talking about, that bark orders at people like him, send him out like he's a weapon or a dog. Gojou could be free to do whatever he wanted, however, he sits behind and listens to the old heads. He would tell Gojou that he could do so much better. Gojou would sit there in silence for a second. However, he would then tell Yuji he understands what he's saying, but the way he wants to go about it is not the right way. There are rules and regulations set in place for a reason. Gojou would tell Yuji that he's strong and can make his own rules because he's strong. However, he doesn't want to rule with an iron fist. He wants to lead those who are weaker than him so they can be strong themselves and not have to rely on people like Gojou himself. Yuji would then let out a long sigh and say that Gojou was boring. He thought he would understand more than anybody else, but it seems Yuji was very wrong. Yuji would tell Gojou that once all of this is over, he was going to kill Kenjaku and take over his plan, doing things the way Yuji wanted to do it, not the way Kenjaku wanted. He would tell Gojou that he could either stand with him or against him. It was his choice. Gojou would laugh and tell Yuji that he was getting beat right now, so why would he stand with him? In Gojou's eyes, Yuji is one of the weak ones. As Yuji would hear this, his eye would twitch. He can understand why Gojou Satoru would call him weak, seeing as he's been the pinnacle of power in the Jujutsu society for a long period of time. But it's just the fact that Gojou called him weak. This would piss Yuji off. Yuji would ask Gojou, is that really so? Does he really think he's weak? Yuji's only been using 2 of his techniques. He hasn't even been using everything. Gojou would only laugh and mock Yuji, saying that he has to steal other people's techniques anyway to make himself stronger. Yuji would let off an irritated smirk, as Gojou could feel an immense amount of cursed energy build up within Yuji. Yuji would tell Gojou that he doesn't need anybody else's curse technique. He could defeat Gojou with his own. Gojou would laugh and tell Yuji he highly doubts that. As Yuji would say enough talking, he would dash in, closing the distance on him and Gojou immediately. Using domain amplification, he would send a punch towards Gojou's chest. Gojou would parry the attack, sending it downwards, trying to send a knee towards Yuji. However, Yuji would block the knee with his own leg. Yuji would then spin around, attempting to backhand Gojou. However, Gojou would grab his arm, picking Yuji up and slamming him into the ground. As Yuji would be slammed into the ground, he would use hand signs, summoning Max Elephant to drop on top of him. The elephant would fall down with reverse gravity technique imbued onto the elephant, slamming into Gojou. However, the infinity would stop it. The attack this time was even closer than it was last time. Yuji would slip into the shadow underneath Gojou, as Gojou would say that he's had enough playing around and that he was going to finish this right here and right now. Gojou would then proceed to use hand signs. He would say domain expansion, infinite void, as the domain would wrap around the subway station, encapsulating Yuji inside of it. However, something confusing would happen. Just like with Mahito, as Gojou would use his domain, instead of targeting Yuji's innate soul, it would target one of the other souls, disabling the technique. Yuji's anti-gravity technique would have been disabled. Gojou would be confused, seeing as Yuji to him, technically, had tanked unlimited void. Yuji would then immediately send his mantles towards Gojou as they would slash at his body. Yuji would smile and tell Gojou that he got him. Mahoraga would come out of Yuji's shadow once more, sending a knee directly towards Gojou, as he was able to block it, but it would send him upwards. Yuji would meet Gojou there with a downward slam, making him crash back into the ground. Yuji would then use flowing red scale stack. Getting even faster, he would rush at Gojou once again. With Gojou being caught off guard by the sudden burst in speed, he would proceed to combo Gojou, hitting him with 2 quick jabs, grabbing his arm, then kneeing him in the stomach. He would then send an uppercut, cracking Gojou in the chin. He would then cock his fist back, just as Gojou did, and smile, asking Gojou, is he still weak? As the punch would connect, cracking Gojou in the stomach, hitting him with a black flash. The domain that Gojou had expanded would collapse, as Gojou would be sent into a nearby wall. Gojou would then begin to feel a wave of uneasiness. He didn't understand what had happened inside of the domain, what had caused Yuji to tank the sure hit effect of his domain. Even with the 6 eyes, he wasn't able to tell. Gojou would wipe the blood from his mouth and tell Yuji that the battle was far from over. In fact, it's only just getting started. Yuji would sit there with Mahoraga on his side, agreeing with Gojou, saying that the battle has only just begun. Everything from this moment on is the real fight, so he'd better be prepared. With both of the fighters operating at 120%, they would rush back in at each other. They would re-engage in hand-to-hand combat. Gojo would send a kick, as Yuji would parry the kick, grabbing Gojo's leg, countering him with an elbow. Gojo would block the elbow, but Yuji would continuously send punches until Gojo was out of position. Yuji would smack away Gojo's hand, capitalizing off the moment, sending several rapid jabs towards Gojo's chest, before finishing the combo with a punch that would knock Gojo's head back. Gojo would bring his head back and headbutt Yuji, causing him to be dazed. The attack would make Yuji stagger a little bit. With Gojo seeing this, throwing a right, Yuji would be startled by the sudden attack, but he would be able to dodge outside of the attack and attempt to counterattack with a left hook. Gojo would duck underneath the attack and land a powerful counterattack on Yuji's ribs. Yuji would wince in pain, as Gojo would send yet another punch, slamming it into Yuji's arms as he would block it. It would send Yuji upwards. However, just then, Gojo would use blue, attracting himself to Yuji instead of attracting Yuji to himself. He would swing again, cracking Yuji across the face. Yuji would take the attack, throwing a punch of his own, cracking Gojo in the face as well. They would begin to trade blows back and forth, with each hit hitting harder than the last. As they would be pushed back from one another, they would re-engage immediately. Gojo would supercharge his fist with cursed energy and unleash rapid fire straight punches towards Yuji. Yuji would be able to block this time, but that wasn't all Gojo was trying to do. He would grab onto Yuji's arm, pulling him forward. He would then send a powerful downward punch, cracking Yuji yet again. This would stagger Yuji once more. Gojo would then cock back his fist, rocketing a punch straight towards Yuji. Just as the attack would be about to land, Mahoraga would hop from Yuji's shadow and take the brunt of the attack, as Gojo would land yet another black flash, blowing the curse's top portion off of its body. However, Mahoraga's wheel would simply spin and he would regenerate himself. Gojo wasn't done though. He didn't care that Mahoraga was finished. He was trying to finish Yuji. Mahoraga would swing a right towards Gojo, but Gojo would grab his arms, throwing him towards Yuji, slamming him into him. He would then use Lapse Blue at maximum output, swinging both Yuji and Mahoraga around the subway station, crashing them both into a wall. Yuji would duck into Mahoraga's shadow as Mahoraga would dash straight towards Gojo. Mahoraga would attempt to swing on Gojo yet again. However, he would simply duck underneath it, but as he would duck underneath it, Yuji would come out from his shadow, sending an uppercut towards Gojo, cracking him in the chin again. Gojo would immediately slam his head back down, cracking Yuji in the head with another headbutt. As Mahoraga would grab onto Gojo, Gojo would use red on Mahoraga, pushing him off of him, slamming him into a wall. But Yuji would already be behind Gojo, sending another punch towards him. However, Gojo would turn around, grabbing the attack, pulling Yuji's arm and cracking him in the face yet again. Yuji could now understand why Gojo was titled the strongest. It seemed as if, no matter how hard Yuji had trained, Gojo was simply still too much for him. But that only made this fight a lot more enjoyable for Yuji. Being able to push him to new limits, being able to push his curse technique, this was the thrill that he's always wanted. Yuji would activate Flowing Red Scale Stack again, grabbing onto Gojo's arm as he was grabbing onto him. Yuji would send himself towards Gojo, sending a punch directly towards his chest. It would crack Gojo in the ribs, but Gojo would simply shrug it off, laughing at Yuji, saying that his attacks had no weight behind it. Just from behind Gojo, Mahoraga would swing down with his Sword of Extermination. Gojo would attempt to block it, but forgot that Infinity wouldn't work on Mahoraga, as Gojo's arm would be sliced off. He would quickly use Reverse Curse technique, swinging himself around, throwing Yuji into Mahoraga, sending a maximum output red into both of them. As they would both slam into the wall of the subway station, Gojo would say that since his domain wouldn't work, he was going to try something else here. He needed Mahoraga to go, so it would only be a one-on-one between him and Yuji. Then, he'd be able to kill Yuji and stop Kenjaku from doing whatever he was going to do. As Yuji would be slightly catching his breath, he could feel the sudden surge of curse energy from Gojo. He knew that this attack was going to be bad. As Gojo would stare at Yuji, he would then proceed to launch a hollow purple straight at Yuji. However, Yuji would summon Mahoraga in front of him, as Mahoraga would take the brunt of the attack, being evaporated, being killed off in one hit, as Yuji would be able to survive the aftermath, seeing as Mahoraga took the initial brunt of the attack. Yuji would be heavily damaged on the floor, trying to use Reverse Curse technique to heal as much of his body as he could. Gojo would stare down at Yuji and tell him that he does still think he's weak. Yuji would take a deep breath in. With his body fully healed with Reverse Curse technique, he would rush in back at Gojo using Domain Amplification. Since Mahoraga was gone, the only way he could damage Gojo was by using Domain Amplification. However, he wasn't going to be able to use any of his techniques. He would send a right towards Gojo, but Gojo would simply dodge backwards, dodging the attack altogether. He would send a kick towards Yuji, kicking him in his stomach, sending him towards the wall again. Yuji would drop down to his knees and begin to cough up blood. He was exhausted. This fight went on way longer than he thought it was going to go. He assumed he would have been able to take down Gojou simply because he had Mahoraga on his side, but it didn't seem that simple at all. Gojou was simply far too experienced for him. Yuji would smile. He would then tell Gojou that it was a shame he wasn't going to be able to see the new world happen. Gojou would raise an eyebrow and ask Yuji what the hell he was talking about. Just then, a voice behind Gojou would speak up, saying hey. Gojou would turn around and see Kenjaku. He would already know about Kenjaku, but still seeing his best friend's body be used in such a manner would confuse him entirely. That one moment alone of hesitation would have caught Gojou off guard. The prison realm was sitting right in front of him, as it would lock onto Gojou and capture him. Gojou wouldn't be able to use curse technique or anything, as he would realize it was actually game over for him. Kenjaku would sit there and explain that it was a shame that Yuji had foiled half of his plans, but it's okay, since Satoru Gojou was now captured, he would kill Yuji anyway, seeing as he was on death's door already. With Gojou sealed and Yuji Itadori dead, Kenjaku would be able to go about his plans regularly without anybody interfering. He just needed someone to be able to take on Gojou Satoru and hold him to a standstill in order for him to get captured. It was a win-win for Kenjaku, since Yuji was already going to betray him. He knew it a while ago. He just had to wait for the right moment. The two strongest sorcerers would fight it out and exhaust each other so that Kenjaku could simply swoop in at the end and take all the credit. It was his lucky day. Gojou would scream at Kenjaku, saying that he has no right to take over a body like that, as Kenjaku would tell Gojou that he has no right to say anything anymore, as he's simply a box. Gojou would curse Kenjaku as he would be folded into the prison realm. Yuji would lay there, tired out and exhausted, as Kenjaku would walk over to him. He would ask Yuji if he had his fun, and it didn't matter if he did or didn't anyway. Yuji was going to die right here, right now. He knew that Yuji was planning to overthrow him eventually. He knew that Yuji would get in his head and attempt to overthrow the system that Kenjaku has in place. But Kenjaku would tell Yuji that no one was going to intervene in the plans he had set up for thousands of years. This was something that was long in the making, and he wasn't going to let someone like Yuji interrupt any of that. He would tell Yuji that once he dies, he's going to revive Sukuna inside of Yuji's body so that the true king of curses could come about into this world. Kenjaku would then use cursed spirit manipulation to summon two special grade cursed spirits. He would tell one of the cursed spirits to hold Yuji down, and he wanted the other one to kill Yuji slowly. He would tell Yuji that this is what he gets for trying to disturb his plans. He would tell Yuji to die as angrily as he could so that maybe he could come back as a cursed spirit and Kenjaku would be able to use him. In this one moment, everything would freeze for Yuji. There's no way everything was going to end here. There's no way he was simply just going to allow Kenjaku to kill him, especially after he just put his life on the line like that. Kenjaku was a bug that needed to be exterminated, and Yuji was going to do exactly that. He couldn't stand the fact that Kenjaku, someone way weaker than him, was attempting to kill him, attempting to bark orders at him again. He just couldn't stand for it. Every bit of strength that anyone else had was meant for Yuji to capture. That was the sole purpose of his life, to become number one and stand at the top of everything. Everything was all for Yuji. It was all for one, and that one was him. Something would click inside of Yuji's head, with all the emotions stirring about. With every last bit of cursed energy he had left, Yuji would open both of his hands, as both of the dots on his hands would begin to glow a bright red. Yuji would then scream the words, "Domain expansion, all for one." Kenjaku would be surprised and confused. He didn't think Yuji had enough cursed energy left to expand a domain. Inside of Yuji's domains, there were hands all around the domain, all of them with red dots on the palm of their hands. But before Kenjaku could even make another move, his body would simply fall over. Inside of Yuji's domain, the sure hit effect was that no matter who was in the domain, if you were caught by the domain, the technique imbued within your soul will be stripped immediately and given to Yuji. The view that everything had belonged to him caused the domain to act that way, and since Kenjaku was technically simply the brain, having his technique stripped would make the body seemingly useless. However, Yuji was able to take both cursed spirit manipulation and Kenjaku's technique itself. As the domain that Yuji had set up would collapse, Yuji would begin to laugh maniacally. He would begin to thank Kenjaku for allowing him to awaken to this one moment alone, and that everything seemed perfect. After everything was said and done here, he would continue Kenjaku's plan. Since Kenjaku had explained everything to him, he would start the culling games and attempt to merge humanity with Tengen. And after he'd do that, he'd plan on taking over the world as he saw fit. He would destroy everything and reshape the entire Jujutsu society and Earth itself, making anyone and everyone bend under his knee. Everything in this world was meant for him, and he sought to take it all. And I think that's where I'm going to end it here. I'm sorry for not uploading yesterday, technically 2 days ago, but I had work to do, and yeah, I'm trying to get my schedule together, but it's not really going the way I want it to go. But I'm still trying to push out these videos for you guys because I know you're expecting it, and I'm sorry again for not uploading for so long. But I really want to thank all of you for the support recently. Honestly, I really love you guys. I'm thankful that you guys support me even if I don't upload within like 2 days or so. So thank you. I really appreciate you. But yeah, thank you for listening, and yeah, peace.